Thank you for joining us for this presentation of Walnut Creek, Past and Present. Our journey begins by learning about the Native Americans who inhabited the region that includes Walnut Creek. We will then move to their contact with Europeans, and then on to the period of rancho land grants when cattle were raised here. We will touch on the times of white settlers and wheat farming, and specific to Walnut Creek, the days of walnut groves. Two early families still making their marks on the community will be discussed, the Bancrofts and the Penimans. After that, we will explore the beginnings of four Walnut Creek community and cultural institutions: Heather Farm Park, Borges Ranch and the Howe Homestead, the Lesher Center for the Arts and Center Rep, and the Lindsay Wildlife Experience. Let's get started. The San Francisco Bay Area is home to the Bay Miwok people, and Mount Diablo is the ethnographic and spiritual center of their culture. The Bay Miwok people are made up of 6 tribes. The tribe known as the Volvan people were those living on Mount Diablo and in its southeast shadow. They were peaceful Costanoan-speaking Native Americans who lived in numerous villages scattered among the 3 creeks at the base of majestic Mount Diablo. The 3,848-foot mountain, called Kuakum, or Laughing Mountain, and fertile valleys provided all the subsistence needs of these hunter-gatherers. Here is artist John Finger's rendering of a Volvan village of the period. The Native Americans of that period survive as part of the present-day Muwekma Ohlone tribe. The tribe actively promotes its language, culture, and traditions throughout the area. In Contra Costa County, there are 87 known Volvan grinding rock sites with over 2,250 mortars, indicating places where they lived and worshipped. Here is a contemporary view of an East Bay Volvan village site. The lands are now owned primarily by the state of California and the Contra Costa Water District. In the spring of 1772, Captain Pedro Fages led the first Europeans to pass the base of Mount Diablo, seeking an overland route to Bodega Bay. Pedro, the Comandante at Monterey, Franciscan missionary Juan Crespi, 14 soldiers, a muleteer, and an Indian servant trekked along the Carquinez Strait and then eastward nearly to Antioch before turning back. There is a historical marker in Danville commemorating Fages' journey. In 1834, Doña Juana Sanchez de Pacheco was granted the 17,734-acre Rancho Arroyo de las Nueces y Borbones, the small stream ranch of the walnuts and borbones, for her husband's service to Mexico. The nuts are the black walnuts native to the creeks and streams of the area. Borbones is the name the Mexican government gave to the Indians in the Ignacio Valley. She later renamed it Rancho San Miguel in honor of her husband. It was one of 4 land grants in the area and included the land that would become the city of Walnut Creek. Upon her death, the rancho was shared among 13 heirs, most of whom were her children. Walnut Creek was originally known as the Corners. That name described the junction of the main roads converging from the towns of Martinez and Pacheco to the north and from Lafayette to the west. It was also where the 4 land grants came together. In 1852, the roads were improved and a trickle of new residents began to settle the area. People were prone to squatting and then eventually purchasing their squats from the heirs of Doña Juana Sanchez de Pacheco. Note how the city has grown from 6 men and his wife to over 70,000 people since 1852. The town was renamed Walnut Creek when its U.S. Post Office was established in 1862. During her lifetime, Doña Juana employed her grandson, Ignacio Cibrian, as her mayordomo to oversee her land grant. She sold him 1,000 acres of the grant for $4,000, and he later inherited 255 acres from his mother, Maria Rosa Pacheco, one of Doña Juana's daughters. Ignacio Cibrian built his home near a sulfur spring on that 255-acre parcel. He renamed his property Sulphur Springs Ranch. From the summit of the hill on his property, he would look down on a forest of giant oak trees where cattle grazed in the fall. The land of the East Bay was devoted to cattle grazing in these early days of the Rancho land grants. The days of cattle ranching were numbered, however. Disillusioned gold seekers, some former farmers, returning to their homes in the east, passed through the fertile valleys surrounding Mount Diablo and recognized the potential for growing crops. They began wheat farming, the traditional staple of the era. Eventually, the wheat farmers moved south to the Central Valley. Fruit and nut farming replaced wheat as primary crops. Farming continued with vigor into the 1930s and ended in the 1960s, when much of the land was rezoned residential and commercial. This is Rogers Ranch, a former wheat farm in nearby Pleasant Hill, California. The ranch is currently used by various small local community organizations for their meetings and events. Note a Luther Burbank connection. In 1915, the ranch was sold to Rollo Hugh, a partner in the Luther Burbank Company, to become a demonstration farm. But because of financial difficulties, it never came to be. The town of Walnut Creek was incorporated in 1914 by vote of 127 to 67 in favor of incorporation. Local merchants wanted to be able to raise local tax funds to pave Main Street. They hoped to shed the commercial area of its dirt road image and attract some of the visitors to the upcoming 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco. Of the fruit grown during the early 1900s, grapes brought in more earnings to local farmers than any other. The first grape festival was held in Walnut Creek in 1911. But in 1920, the Volstead Act ushered in prohibition and doomed the production of wine grapes. Most farmers in Walnut Creek's Ignacio Valley ripped up their vines. For 10 years, they were without income from their lands. In place of their vines, the farmers planted black walnut seedlings. After 4 or 5 years, the seedlings would grow to 3 to 5 inches in diameter. The farmers then cut off the seedlings a few feet above the ground and grafted English walnut shoots to the trunks. The resulting nuts had more than double the meat and were easier to shell. After 9 or 10 years, valley farmers were again able to recognize favorable returns from the land. The importance of walnuts was celebrated with the first Walnut Festival Parade on October 4, 1936. The festival continues to this day. Walnut Creek's Ignacio Valley became known as a shade land, with the spread of wide-reaching limbs shading the ground wherever walnut trees grew. Because of the eye appeal of well-manicured walnut groves, Ignacio Valley became the destination of motorists from San Francisco and the East Bay on their Sunday drives. In 1946, the tonnage of the valley's walnut harvest reached a peak never again equaled. An affliction called dieback struck, from which the walnut groves never recovered. Dieback is the name given to what appears to be a blockage of sap at the graft. By the early 1950s, Valley farmers began selling their land to developers for subdivisions. Two families from that era of fruit and nut farming are still remembered in Walnut Creek today. The Mount Diablo fruit farm was started in the 1880s by two brothers, one of whom was Hubert Howe Bancroft, a famous historian and publisher who amassed a huge personal library of books related to the American West. Bancroft sold his important collection to the University of California for only a fraction of its value. That collection became the nucleus of the world-famous Bancroft Library. In the 1930s, the Bancroft farm was awarded first place in the state for pears 8 out of 9 years. At the height of production, the farm had 200 seasonal employees. Pears were shipped to the east and as far away as England. The farm was passed down to Philip Bancroft Sr. and then to his son, Philip Bancroft Jr. The farm remained in operation until the late 1960s when the property was rezoned for city residential use. In 1971, the last walnut orchard on the property was cut down. Philip Jr. offered his wife Ruth 3 acres of the former farm to begin a new garden using her large collection of succulents, which had outgrown their space at home. Ruth, then in her 60s, seized this opportunity. On the left, Ruth is seen working with her husband Phil to fill the pond that had been created. On the right, we see construction of the folly at the rear of the garden. All the work went on under the watchful eye of one of the garden residents. And here's the finished project, the folly and the pond. This is the garden as it exists today. The Ruth Bancroft Garden is a foremost example of the art of garden design using drought-tolerant plants, and is known as one of the finest dry gardens in the world. The garden displays an expansive collection of plants from the world's desert and Mediterranean climates, collected by Ruth for over 60 years. Ruth Bancroft passed away on November 26, 2017, at the age of 109. A tribute to doing what you love and loving what you do. Another Walnut Creek farm family still with us today in spirit is the Penniman family, who farm property near the Bancrofts. Their Shadelands fruit farm operated until 1942, growing fruit, pears, apricots and plums, and nuts, walnuts and almonds. Hiram Penniman, New York native, farmer, business owner, former gold miner, and patriarch of the family, was the second Walnut Creek postmaster. He had laid out the town site of the Corners in 1856. He was also responsible for realigning the town's primary north-south road away from the downtown creek, which flooded routinely, and creating Main Street in the process. Was it a coincidence that the newly created Main Street passed in front of the retail store that Hiram owned? Shadelands, the Penniman home, was begun in 1902 and completed the following year. It is a 2-story, 4-bedroom colonial revival style house. It also includes a basement and an attic. The house is 3,442 square feet. The last surviving family member created a foundation to manage the family home and property. Eventually, the property was sold to developers, and the home and 1.5 acres of land were gifted to the city of Walnut Creek in 1970 for $1. A few years prior to the gifting of the property, the Walnut Creek Women's Club had made it a club project to sponsor an historical society. The city turned to this new Walnut Creek Historical Society to restore the 1903 Penniman home to its original condition for use as an historic house museum, highlighting life in Walnut Creek in the early days of the 20th century. The Shady Ladies rose to the challenge, presenting the city and its residents the beautiful, restored Shadelands Ranch Museum. In the course of clearing out the items stored in the house, the ladies found architectural treasure in the attic and basement. an original 1925 pencil drawing by legendary architect Frank Lloyd Wright for an innovative Chicago skyscraper, a color version of the same drawing in a 1910 Berlin portfolio featuring plans and drawings of Wright's most important building designs up to that point in his career. The skyscraper drawings had been commissioned by Albert Johnson, husband of Bessie Penniman of Shadelands Ranch. The items were put up for auction at a Christie's sale of Frank Lloyd Wright artifacts in New York. Total bids, $244,000. Net to the Historical Society, $215,000. The money went toward the needed restoration and renovation work, and the surplus exists today as the Frank Lloyd Wright Fund. The house became the headquarters of the Historical Society as well as the City Museum. On August 29, 1985, Shadelands Ranch became the second Walnut Creek landmark to be listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Here we see Shadelands as it exists today. Next, we turn our attention to some of the community and cultural resources in Walnut Creek and trace their beginnings. In 1921, John W. Marchbank, a wealthy gambling hall owner with a colorful past, purchased the 255-acre Sulphur Springs Ranch, originally owned by Ignacio Cibrian, grandson of Doña Juana Sanchez de Pacheco. An interim owner had lost it to foreclosure. Marchbank renamed the property Heather Farm after his champion stallion, King Heather. Marchbank invested $1 million to build a Spanish-style mansion, a half-mile track encircled by a white fence, a 48-stall stable, and a barn. Heather Farm became the most important horse breeding farm west of the Mississippi, raising dozens of champions. John Marchbank retired to Heather Farm and died in 1947. The operations at Heather Farm caught the attention of the Hollywood set. The outdoor scenes of the movie Sporting Blood were filmed at Heather Farm. A dust storm in the film was created by someone pulling a tractor and a drag. The local firemen made it rain for certain scenes. But the most memorable special effect of the film was Clark Gable in his first starring role. Gable was sufficiently unknown at the time that the local Courier-Journal newspaper misspelled his name, Goble. The film played at the Ramona Theater on Main Street in Walnut Creek on September 4th and 5th, 1931. After John Marchbank passed away, his widow sold the property to Atherton developer Thomas G. Stone, who was unable to realize his vision for the property, 800 homes. After several interim transactions, a 50-acre parcel of the property was acquired by the city of Walnut Creek and developed as a park and swimming complex. Heather Farm Park has since grown to 102 acres. It contains the gardens at Heather Farm, a swimming pool, inclusive playground, sports fields, equestrian center, dog park, fishing pond, nature area, lake, and other amenities. The entrance to Marchbank's estate and Heather Farm featured a sign with his monogram. Longtime Walnut Creek resident Harmon Howard safeguarded it in his backyard for decades before returning it to Heather Farm Park in 1995. It now graces the entrance to the equestrian center at the park. The City of Walnut Creek Open Space Division manages over 3,000 acres of open space in 4 unique areas and over 7 miles of neighborhood trails. These areas have been set aside to preserve natural resources, protect wildlife habitat and corridors, and provide recreation opportunities. Walnut Creek was the first city in California to actively purchase and preserve open spaces. The outdoor recreation activities have been much used and appreciated during the pandemic. 2 of these 4 open space properties are of historical interest. Borges Ranch is part of the Shell Ridge open space. It is nestled in the foothills of Mount Diablo. The ranch was established in 1899 by Portuguese settler Francisco Borges and his family, and is a great example of an early 20th century Central California cattle ranch. Today, many of the original buildings and structures still exist, including the Borges family home, which is one of 7 structures placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1981. Here are 2 of Francisco's grandsons in 2006 at the ranch he started with 700 acres of land and the unwanted calves purchased from other ranches in the area. The other open space of historical interest, Howe Homestead Park, is the former home of James P. Howe, an Associated Press correspondent from the early 20th century. He was born in Kansas and traveled the world, reporting on events such as the San Francisco earthquake in 1906 and World War I. Howe interviewed numerous people who influenced the world, including Stalin, King George V, and Gandhi. In 1910, he purchased approximately 7 acres of land in Walnut Creek and named it Gopher Gulch Ranch. After retiring to Walnut Creek in 1935, he pursued his passions there. He was a winemaker, breeder of pigeons, nut grower, gourmet, and collector. Here, he is being interviewed by Jane Lee on NBC Radio about his pigeon flute collection. He willed that collection of rare Manchurian pigeon whistles to the Oriental Collection of UC Berkeley and the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. Howe Homestead Park is 5 acres in size and has a community garden, a pollinating garden, and a rose garden, in addition to offering hiking trails and picnic tables. Walnut Creek folks thought that they had arrived by the 25th anniversary of incorporation in 1939. Its main street had become the route for 2 state highways. The city supported not 1, but 2 movie theaters. But by the 1980s, there was a desire for more sophisticated entertainment. The city had grown in both numbers and affluence. A partnership between the City of Walnut Creek and private donors created the Regional Center for the Arts, which, when completed, housed an 800-seat theater, a 300-seat theater, a 150-seat theater, and an art gallery. The complex was renamed the Lesher Center for the Arts in 1995 after a generous gift from the Dean and Margaret Lesher Foundation. Dean Lesher was an independent newspaper baron who had a long association with Walnut Creek. He and Margaret were the city's most noted arts benefactors. The opening gala in 1990 was headlined by Bob Hope, Joel Grey, Vic Damone, and Diane Carroll. Center Rep is the resident professional theater company of the Lesher Center for the Arts. Each season consists of 6 productions, a mix of musicals, dramas, and comedies, both classic and contemporary. All the artists and artisans are career theater practitioners. Each production is conceived and developed at the Lesher Center. The sets and costumes are built in the Lesher's shops, and the actors rehearse at the center. Center Rep productions have garnered numerous awards from Bay Area theater organizations. Moving from culture to learning, we come to the story of Alexander Lindsay. More than 60 years ago, Alexander Sandy Lindsay shared his curiosity and passion for the natural world with the people of Walnut Creek, especially its children. What started as a garage full of locally collected specimens and the occasional wild animal slowly developed into a series of informal classes and neighborhood hikes. This early backyard collection came to be known as the Diablo Jr. Museum. Lindsay quickly inspired like-minded individuals to cooperate with his education efforts. In 1955, the Diablo Jr. Museum Association officially formed, and so began what is now the Lindsay Wildlife Experience. From 1965 until 1993, the expanded museum was housed in an abandoned East Bay Municipal Utility District pump house. In December 1993, the museum moved to spacious new quarters nearby, thanks to a $2 million contribution and a $600,000 loan from the city of Walnut Creek. Today, the organization is the country's first wildlife hospital, a zoological organization, and an educational museum specializing in native California wildlife. Every year, its veterinarians, husbandry experts, biologists, and teachers treat more than 5,000 wild animal patients, care for the 70 animal ambassadors that call Lindsay home, and educate approximately 100,000 people. And so concludes our journey. I hope you've enjoyed getting to know more about Walnut Creek. We look forward to hosting you all in person soon. Thank you.